Well, my friends and listeners, I have set a new essay loose, one thread in the long line I keep weaving around Velázquez, since my head and heart keep returning to him, and since Dublin shelters a canvas that speaks straight to our doorstep. Kitchen maid, with the supper at Emmaus, waits in the National Gallery of Ireland, where the hush of the gallery yields while a kitchen breath rises, and where a young woman meets the tremor of revelation through work that never seeks a trumpet. Because so many of you pass that room on many occasions, I invite you to stand before her and give the picture the time it earns, as the scene in the hatch begins to breathe once your own breath steadies. My kinship with Velázquez reaches back to the quick of childhood, as those portraits of dwarfs claimed me when I counted only 3 years on the earth, and as I greeted them as companions I fully expected to encounter. Since life often keeps its promises in surprising ways, I believe I have greeted them more than once, especially my steadfast friend Sebastián de Mora, whose gaze still steadies my own. If you care for such roads of recognition, wander across to my blog, where this Irish located piece, dear to me for reasons you will sense, and a few further surprises humbly await for your generous consideration. And now please, kindly step inside, smell the warm bread, set your sight and see for yourself. A copper sheen woke the wall of my childhood, and a pair of eyes, stern and sovereign with a kindness that arrived strangely, took up residence in the quiet where toys kept their drowsy patrol and dust, learned a slow dance in the slant of noon. I remember carpet under my knees and the album's grave weight as pages swung like chapel doors, and although grand rooms rose while royals held their combed composure, my gaze kept faith with a smaller throne where Sebastián de Mora sat cacked as an oath and bright with an intelligence that measured the world without apology. I saluted him with the candor children carry as easily as breath, and I named him friend because one look, once returned, seals a pact as firmly as any handshake. My parents, amused and half amazed, welcomed a miniature oil that brought Sebastián across the threshold, so that a window hung above my bed and taught me, long before classrooms, that painted faces carry breath and that a look may steady a life. Years later, when the Liffey wore pewter and buses sighed as though the city exhaled through valves, I stepped into the National Gallery of Ireland and entered a kitchen where light became a blade and mercy rose like steam. The room breathed through clay and metal and bone, since Velázquez, scarcely 19 and already obedient to a grammar shaped by labour and prayer, arranges the foreground with an exactness that grants each thing a vocation. A glazed earthenware jug curves like a shoulder bred for water and errands. Garlic lifts a chalk-dry crown that promises savour and sting. A copper alcaraza drinks heat and answers with a tender, sweating shimmer. A fish lies upon a plate as if the season had written its name across that silver skin. Cloth rubs itself into usefulness, while pewter softens to a pewter moon and porous clay accepts its long thirst, and the maid, turning within that weather of work, submits sleeve and wrist to a rhythm learned one task at a time. The Bodigon invites appetite while it tutors thought, and the painter, pricked by the tenebrist spark that Caravaggio's followers had scattered across Seville, draws a beam as a surgeon draws breath before an incision, since the cut must heal even as it opens. Behind her, a hatch yields as though the wall learned mercy and granted a view. There, at a table that keeps the quiet of evening, Christ shares bread with companions who have walked themselves thin with grief, and as his hands enact the Fractio Panis, recognition ignites with the clean urgency of truth. Luke gives the order. A stranger listens and teaches. Bread breaks and eyes open. Presence alters and sight shifts. The little room burns like a struck string, and the wave leaves that chamber and crosses tile and plaster until the air near the mortar ripples against the maid's inner ear, so that she inclines, and the spine receives meaning before the tongue finds words. Sound carries the charge, since the painting hides its music in gesture. A breath caught between syllables, or a chair foot trailing an arc across floorboards, or a name released as a prayer travels farther than any candle's reach, and she gathers it. Her head tilts by a degree that reads as assent, and understanding begins as a tremor that steadies rather than shakes. Through her, the miracle acquires a witness whose attention consecrates the room more surely than any ritual, because obedience to truth begins in listening, and only later flowers into speech. She hears, and hearing becomes knowledge. Her lineage speaks through the sun retained in her skin, and the Moorish trace, carried in the angle of cheek and brow, and the century, which would prefer a scullery door to keep its secrets, receives a correction that arrives without trumpet. A Morisca stands at the hinge of salvation history, and the canvas grants centre without fuss, which amounts to boldness in a Spain that still tasted the iron of expulsions. Velázquez, faithful to a sacramental imagination that seeks God amid bowls and knives as readily as upon altars, trusts the Emmaus thunder to a woman the city measures as marginal, and he does so with a tenderness that spares her pity and a clarity that spares the viewer confusion. The hand that scours a pot gains the right to speak for prophets once revelation crosses the middle ear and reaches the heart. Seville at that hour smelled of incense, while docks bled cochineal and indigo, and confraternities moved like weather through narrow streets. A young painter, pledged to his master's daughter, schooled in counter-Reformation ardour, hunted a form that would keep altar and larder in the same vision. He found it here because doctrine arrives across a table and through a hatch, and because grace favours presence over parade, so that pewter and consecrated loaf rhyme across space without rivalry. The fish remembers the ichthys, that cipher spelling Isis Christos, Theoios Soter, and the season written into its flesh keeps Lenten grammar that harmonizes with hands in the other room as blessing lifts and falls. The fathers who loved figures and thresholds would recognize the hospitality at work, since Augustine teaches that welcome ripens recognition as surely as learning ripens praise, and since Origen, ardent for meanings behind appearances, would read Jerusalem and Emmaus as stations on the soul's advance. The maid, whose day swings from vita activa toward a hunger that points beyond bread, occupies the seam where action yields to contemplation while the bowl remains in reach. Ignatian wisdom calls for finding God in all things. The painting obeys, because a pewter rim catches the same charged beam that crowns a disciple's lifted face, and because garlic, bright as chalk under that light, receives attention equal to any aureole. My pact with Sebastian de Mora returns at this counter, since he seated compact as a clenched verdict, and facing the viewer with an authority that requests neither pardon nor permission, taught me that intelligence abides wherever a life can breathe, and that dignity enters a room when presence stands its ground. The maid inherits his kinship across time. She gathers force without raising her voice. She takes command without ceremony. She enlarges her post without departing from it. She holds the room's meaning in the angle of her neck and in the measured pause of her hands. A sovereign soul wears court silk on one day and kitchen linen on another. Hierarchy yields once attention names the truth. The composition conceals its boldest act in plain sight, because the sanctified scene withdraws into a square at the back, while the foreground claims the field, and the old ladder of subjects gives way to a new arithmetic where resonance outweighs spectacle. The event in the hatch kindles conscience in the kitchen, and art, which often pretends allegiance to display, here crowns attention as the higher right. From that decision a road bends toward Las Meninas, where rooms interrogate rooms and sightlines argue like cousins at a wake, yet the seed lies in Seville, in a kitchen that grants a loaf its mystery and listens for the echo. In the gallery, rain kept its soft persecution of the glazing outside, while a guard's stride translated reverence into footfall. I stood until the floor learned my weight, and the breath fell into a rule, 4 counts in and 4 counts out, so that plate and jug and copper vessel entered the chest as companions who cherish silence. A woman nearby cleared her throat, and the small sound rang like a fork kissed by china. She leaned in the same degree the maid leans, and the room accepted her as a second witness. Dublin hummed beyond the doors, gulls carving grey air while engines murmured, and the kitchen held its pressure as the bright box behind the maid burned with recognition. The ear, tutored by a lifetime of rooms, received what the eye had already begun to trust. We depart with her pause intact, since she stands between two obediences, work that shapes muscle and grace that shapes meaning, and the day outside repeats the lesson when we give it room. Stop and listen so that receiving may ripen into reply. A bell within lifts its tongue as bread parts, a copper lip holds a last bead of water, a word crosses a threshold, and the hinge between worlds swings easily, as though attention had laid oil upon it.